This panel will examine the content and the process for passage of the First Step Act, which you've already been hearing so much about today. We will hear from the key drivers of the legislation and learn about more reforms to come. Moderating this panel is Holly Harris, Executive Director of the Justice Action Network. I had the privilege to work directly with firsthand with Holly on the First Act, and I can attest that while Holly shied away from the limelight and taking credit, this law passed because of Holly's tenacious, brilliant, and trailblazing efforts to marshal overwhelming bipartisan support for the law. Holly is a very dear friend of Aleph's. We thank you, Holly, for your inspiring willingness to insist anytime your help is needed. We've already heard several times today the name Matthew Charles. I'd like to say my dear friend Matthew Charles, who is truly an extraordinary human being, and it's truly an honor for us, Matthew, that you're here with us today. The other two gentlemen who happen to be on the panel are two wonderful human beings, and this I know firsthand because I had the pleasure to speak to both of them during the course of the First Step Act. The Honorable Ranking Member of the House Judiciary Committee, Doug Collins, and the Honorable Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. I want everybody here to know you're looking at two very courageous men, because the two of them reached across the lines and made a bipartisan approach to get this bill done. And if I'm a neophyte when it comes to the criminal justice system, I'm a neophyte in steroids when it comes to the political process. But I know that these two gentlemen stood up to the powers that be and the senior members of each of their parties to see to it that this act became the law. In fact, it was Congressman Jeffries who had the brilliant idea to name the act the First Step Act. And it was Congressman Collins who tenaciously advocated with people who think that justice reform is a dirty word to make sure that this bill passed and is now the law. So I just thank all four of you for everything that you've done, and I'm really looking forward to this panel.
And my name is Holly Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Justice Action Network. I was just saying that I wanted to thank Aleph. I'm from Kentucky, I'm from the South, so we say Aleph. So I was just hearing Gary say Aleph, which sounds very sophisticated. But without Aleph, the First Step Act would have never passed without the great advocacy of all the rabbis who probably called me 3 or 4 times a day and certainly had no problem calling super early in the morning and super late at night. And just were just tenacious and zealous advocates for the bill that we're going to talk about a little bit here today. And then I'd like to move forward and talk about other priorities. But it's great to have Matthew Charles with us today. Matthew is obviously formerly incarcerated. Most of us know his story. But I just wanted to say that I think the fellowship that you're doing with FAMM now is one of the most impactful. It's probably the most impactful work that's being done in criminal justice reform today. So very, very grateful for that. And then we were asked to do, I guess, an additional introduction of the two congressmen. And since we all know these two gentlemen well, almost everybody in the room has worked at least all the advocates have worked pretty closely with the two congressmen. I wanted to share that they have a playlist on Spotify together called Summertime Heat. You should check it out. Congressman Collins' favorite song is Clarity by Zedd, and Congressman Jeffries' favorite song is Sky's the Limit by Biggie Smalls. So, little known facts about my friends. And again, instead of giving their resumes, I did want to share a video with all of you all that was commissioned by the Justice Action Network that I think gives a little bit more insight into this great partnership between Congressman Jeffries and Congressman Collins, and more importantly, their deep friendship.
Well, there are some who suggested that Doug Collins and I have engaged in a bipartisan bromance, but at the end of the day, he's a good man. He has a good heart. In fact, he's got a head for the work and a heart for the people.
What we're starting to get now is, Doug and Hakeem are talking, what are they up to? I think that's become more of the interesting issue, and it's been good. And I think, like I said, what we do and how we complement each other is we complement each other in the ways that we want to find, common ground and how we work through things.
It's been our view that we have to take criminal justice outside of the political space in order to arrive at the right solutions for dealing with the overcriminalization problem and mass incarceration epidemic that we have in America. Well, the First Step Act does several things to bring hope, opportunity, and a chance at transformation to tens of thousands of currently incarcerated individuals by bringing to life the type of reentry programming, education, vocational opportunities, substance abuse counseling, and mental health services that are proven to reduce recidivism and help individuals transform themselves into productive citizens upon release.
Well, I think the shackling issue is, again, I think most people don't realize it's going on. Even if it happens to one, it shouldn't. And so for someone to be shackled during a pregnancy that is just something that most people would find, amazing, if anything, or abhorrent, as most of us would.
The First Step Act is incredibly meaningful because it would prohibit the shackling of pregnant women from the moment they are medically determined to be with child through giving birth to the child and for an additional 3 months during the post-pregnancy period.
Of course, my mom and my wife. My wife, Lisa, is my heartbeat. I have a daughter who has spina bifida, and Jordan has more dignity and a better attitude about life than I could ever imagine. I don't have the strength that Jordan has.
Growing up, my mother would make sure that she always took my brother and I to Sunday school every morning. In fact, we used to believe that we were mailmen for Christ, because if it was Sunday morning, it didn't matter whether it was raining, snowing, sleeting, or hailing. If it was Sunday morning, we were going to church to go to Sunday school. And the lessons that I learned, not just from my mom, but my grandmom and so many other church mothers, about the importance of family and community and treating everyone with dignity and respect, have played an important role in the work that I've endeavored to do here in the United States Congress.
From my faith perspective, I believe that on my worst day, Christ stood with me. How could I not stand with somebody on their worst day? And so if I couldn't, then my faith is not being acted out, as it said. And so for me, that's just a thing of taking who I am, believing it, and trying to put it in action, failing many times probably, but trying every day to get better.
At the end of the day, the American people want their representatives in the United States Congress to make life better for the American people. And in this regard, the First Step Act helps the most vulnerable amongst us who are currently incarcerated, living without hope or opportunity or a meaningful shot at transformation, in a manner that will also improve public safety and save taxpayer dollars. That's a win-win for everybody.
I think they're going to see an administration and a Congress that said, we want to do something that matters to individuals. And there may be a cell, someone sitting in a jail, a federal penitentiary somewhere in this country, who may have thought that somebody gave up on them. And my hope would be is they see that signing and say, I made a mistake, I should be here, but I want to make it better when I get out. And I may never meet that person, but they'll see that and they'll say somebody cares.
I was given a 35-year sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. I sold crack cocaine. And when I was locked up, I ended up becoming a Christian. And because of that, I entered prison a different person. And after 21 and a half years, after the 2010 changes to the sentencing guidelines, whereas crack cocaine was being lowered because it was a known fact that it takes to powder cocaine, there was racial disparity attached to the drug type. So therefore, I was able to have my sentence reduced. I filed to have that sentence reduced. Judge Kevin Sharp, federal judge, released me. I was out for nearly 2 years. The government successfully appealed it, and I was ordered to go back to serve that remaining 10-year sentence. And because of these two gentlemen and the rest of the senators and congressmen, the First Step Act passed, and it had a condition in it to make retroactive those changes to the 2010 sentencing guidelines. And because of that, I was released January the 3rd. And since my release, I was invited to the State of the Union, and then afterwards, I was also hired by FAMM, which is Families Against Mandatory Minimums, to go around and be a Justice Reform Fellow. In that position, I've been able to go to several states, speaking with several governors and state legislators about the changes to the criminal justice system, as well as share my story and speak to them about what changes could help the citizens of their town.
Okay, dish it. Which governor is your favorite?
I got to say it because I got to return home, my Governor Bill Lee of Tennessee.
Somebody in the room will tweet that, and you'll be in good shape.
Okay.
So, I mean, we obviously know that the First Step Act was incredibly impactful to your life.
Yes, it was.
There was a lot of celebrating, gentlemen, after the passage of your bill, and the celebration was warranted. This was a groundbreaking effort that was going to release ultimately thousands of people from prison. There have been some challenges and some delays in implementation. And I wanted to ask you, and we'll start with you, Congressman Jeffries, put you on the hot seat. What is your greatest concern right now about implementation? And then Congressman Collins, I'm going to follow up with you about, what you all plan to do about that.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Certainly thankful for the Institute's tremendous advocacy, and Holly for the great work that you have done, and Matthew for the inspirational story that you continue to tell now all across the country. And we're thankful for your willingness to advance the call for criminal justice reform moving forward, and of course to my good friend Doug Collins. And I say that saying that sometimes, all across the country, you'll see members of Congress say, my good friend from the great state of California, or the distinguished gentleman from the great state, my good friend from New Jersey. Most of the time that we say my good friend, we don't mean it. But I certainly mean it as it relates to Doug Collins. And it's been a great friendship and partnership. And we continue to try to advance the ball for the American people. I think moving forward, we just want to make sure that the spirit and the letter of the law is fully implemented. One of the most important provisions of the First Step Act related to something called Goodtime Credit, where we believe that the Bureau of Prisons, under multiple administrations, Democratic, Republican administrations in the past and present, was misapplying congressional intent and capping the number of days per year that you could earn off of your sentence at 47. We believe it was actually 54, consistent with the congressional intent, but we clarified that and believe that we made it clear that that clarification, the increase from 47 to 54, should be made retroactive. But the Bureau of Prisons has interpreted the language differently, in that they agree it was increased to 54, they agree that it was made retroactive, but because of a provision that they believe is related in terms of the risk assessment tool, they've come to the conclusion that until that risk assessment tool has been completed, the retroactive application of the Goodtime Credit cannot be implemented. We think that once that happens, and we're working through that issue, you'll see an additional 4,000 people potentially eligible to be returned to society within weeks after that decision, and we're certainly working through that. I believe that the administration, their best interests should be aligned with our perspectives, because this was all done together. And of course, Jared Kushner, from the administration standpoint, was an important partner from the very beginning of this. He's not a part of the Department of Justice, obviously, But hopefully the Department of Justice will see their way toward full implementation sooner rather than later.
Well, again, it's good to be back on stage with Hakeem, and it's truly interesting, as you saw from the video there, and it's good to be with you. Never would as Holly and I were sort of joking, a Georgia boy at Columbia Law School. Okay, it's pretty good for us, making this up here. But to be with Hakeem and to be with a friend that we can talk, and for those who just were interested, First Step Act was not our first rodeo. We had several other bills that, and we've joked a lot of times that we're as different as night and day, and many times could argue over a lot of things, but there was those times we knew that our job was to find common ground, and this is one of the things in the First Step Act. This is why implementation, I'm going to take it a step further, and he brought up part of the Goodtime Credit issue, and it's one of the reasons why I've talked to the chairman, and he and I talk regularly about this, is that I believe that in some ways the heavy lifting of the First Step Act is now. It's getting the bill passed. We were able to do that, and that's a whole other book that we could write and talk about how that sausage was made, in a sense. But it was something that was very difficult. A lot of different sides, a lot of different perspectives, left, right, in the middle. Some wanting to give up. I remember a meeting that Hakeem and I left right after we were May of 2018. It's already amazing. It's been over a year now. About a week after that, we went over to the Senate. You remember this meeting? It was with Senator Cornyn from Texas. We went over because they were going to pick it up. And we were all gung ho. We had just fought the battles. We were the weary troops. We were coming in off the battlefield saying, okay. And they looked at us and said, well, we've got a couple of co-sponsors. We'll see if we get to it. And we've been talking to them the whole time. And it was like, okay, no, let's pick up the pace here. And we began to push this. But the next part is the most important part. And this is where Chairman Nadler and I have had the conversations about the implementation hearings. The oversight of implementation on the Bureau of Prisons, Department of Justice is the next area that we've got to have. There will not be a second step if we do not properly implement the first step. It was hard enough for us to convince our colleagues that this was a good step in many cases. It was hard enough for them to take their step and vote yes and not have their own agenda to want more or less, depending on the perspective. But if we don't make this right, and I've talked to the administration about this, Jared, I think, understands this, the others do, then we'll never get to the second step or the next progression of this. And I think that is the thing that I would want the advocates to begin to really talk about is how do we actually make that happen and get the perspective of oversight done so that it is done properly with congressional intent so that we can then get to the next level.
And one of the great frustrations that there's so many other issues taking up all the oxygen in the room, and whether you're a big fan of the Mueller investigation or you're not or whatever, it is making it more difficult to make the implementation of First Step a priority. But in order to make some news today, I thought I could share a bit about the conversation we had backstage. You can never trust me. But because both of you believe that we need to have an oversight hearing to ensure that DOJ and BOP is, properly and swiftly implementing First Step and, adhering to the spirit and to the intentions of Congress, right?
No, definitely. I mean, look, I can't emphasize again. I said it just
y'all to tweet that.
I cannot emphasize this again. For those advocates, if you believe you've successfully had your party, go on, life is better. And we have Matthew here who, look, Hakeem and I have talked about this. But when Matthew came to see us in January, literally when I hugged him, I cried. Because, I mean, how many times do you actually put a piece of legislation? And I made this comment to the president. I said, Mr. President, when you sign this bill, it's not simply lines on a page. There's faces behind the lines. And how many times do you get to hug the face? I mean, you don't. That's just not what we get to do. And as polarized and as life goes in our what we do, this was a very special moment that should be celebrated and implemented. But if we don't get this done, forget it. I don't care what you're wanting to do, what minor step you may think it is. If we're not able to say that we kept our promise on this part and get it implemented properly, it'll be almost impossible to get to the next level.
Okay. So Matthew, obviously talked about how wonderful the First Step Act has been for you and for hundreds of others thus far. But we did hear about a really tragic event. Actually, it was, I think, the same day as the White House event. It was a member of the FAMM family, Frederick Rick Turner, had died in a Florence, Colorado prison, I believe. And Rick Turner was a first-time drug offender who went up for 40 years, right? Actually, the kingpin of the drug scheme that he was convicted of being a part of got half that amount of time because, of course, he cooperated with the government and then informed on lesser participants like Rick. Well, of course, you know, Rick was, because of his 40-year sentence, was sent to, you know, a prison known to have a very violent population. And almost immediately, he was writing to anyone and everyone about how afraid he was of a white supremacist group that was targeting him in prison. And, you know, less than a year later, Rick Turner is dead. Had he been sentenced under or after the First Step Act took effect, he would have only been given half the time. He would have only been sentenced to half the time, which wouldn't have saved him. That would have been, you know, probably no solace to his family. It's no solace to his family now. But I just wanted to ask you, Matthew, in light of that tragic event, do some of the things that we're seeing right now, and some of the announcements that were, you know, made at the White House, and some of the reforms that were low-hanging fruit reforms that we're passing in the states, does it feel small?
In comparison to his life, it feels small, but it's humongous. It's going to benefit hundreds of thousands of people. Like Nancy Gerster, the judge that spoke earlier, and as well as Kara stated, the fact that you give a person a long or a rigid sentence and you can't take into accountability any other factors but what the guidelines state. See, in Rick's sentence, he ended up getting it stacked. And by him being a first-time offender, he actually went in with a 40-year sentence, which caused him to go to Florence, Colorado max. And as you stated, his life was in jeopardy because you're taking a guy from society and putting him in the worst type of environment that's possible for a prisoner. But I remain hopeful, and as you stated, the White House and many things that the White House has done and is doing is always favorable and welcome, and it's result-based, so I got to give them that credit. But to say, in comparison to Rick losing his life, my thing is that he should have had an appropriate sentence going in, and therefore he would have never been there to lose his life.
So, Congressman Jeffries, sort of piggybacking on that conversation, you know, again, had Rick been sentenced after the First Step Act took effect, he would have had, you know, half the sentence, 20 years is what I've been told. So is there any discussion about a real push to make the modest sentencing reforms that were in the First Step retroactive?
Well, I certainly think that's something that we should strongly consider, and we took a meaningful step toward the principle of retroactivity in the First Step Act. As Matthew explained, 2010, under the previous administration, the Fair Sentencing Act was passed, and it reduced the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1. And that disparity existed at 100 to 1, even though, of course, there's no pharmacological difference. I've always wanted to use that word.
That's impressive.
I can't spell it, but I know what it means.
That is a very Columbia word.
No chemical difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And so what was the justification for it? But it took it down to 18 to 1, but was not made retroactive. And then, of course, in connection with the First Step Act, was made retroactive. And so that established, I think, an important precedent. In terms of some of the particular provisions of sentencing reform that were prospective in this bill, the expansion of the applicability of the safety valve so that judges would have additional discretion to take into account a wide variety of factors in the best interests of justice, seems to many of us that retroactive applicability of a principle like that makes sense where possible, right, where there can be sentencing reconsideration, and also in the context of eliminating the stacking. That is probably what was primarily responsible for the additional 20 years, jumping it up to 40. That obviously no longer exists in the form that it did as a result of the First Step Act. And so I think as we contemplate how to move forward, I agree with what Doug said. One, we have to make sure that implementation occurs fully as it relates to the First Step Act across a wide variety of areas, including around the compassionate release provision that many people in this room worked hard on, and that's going to be important. And I support the Judiciary Committee upon which I sit, moving to a meaningful oversight hearing sooner rather than later.
Tweet that,
regard.
tweet that.
But I think retroactivity, as it relates to sentencing provisions that Congress has now determined to be presumptively unjust, I think the logical extension of that is to look at addressing those who were sentenced under provisions that are not fair.
And I think continuing on that same theme, it's not just necessarily what was in this bill, which I think is great in these provisions that we've talked about, and where it goes next. And there's issues of like ban the box, but Elijah Cummings and I have band together on the fair chance, which is again another step. But again, and it was what Matthew said was so important in comparison to a life lost, or even, and not even a life lost as far as to death, but just a life lost to prison and a life lost to an excessive sentence that didn't need to happen to start with. I think what I'm so proud of Hakeem and I coming together, and by the way, his folks notice as well, it wasn't made point, but this is the majority caucus chair. He heads all the Democrats in the House. That's how much they respect him, and I respect our work together. When we do this together, we were able to do something that for so long became a political hot potato. Nobody wanted to touch it. And I think for the first time on the national level, we were actually saying, let's have a conversation. Let's make you uncomfortable, but let's have a conversation about this. Let's say what is fair, what is right, what can we do, and how do we move forward? And so now, after passing this act last year, we have people who had normally never wanted to talk about this in many times in red states like that I come from, or very conservative states, leading the way, where they had not been in before. We had more progressive states doing the lifting. Now we're having a lot happen in different states where they realize this is not something that you have to go in front of your constituents and say, well, I'm ashamed of this, or I didn't vote for this because I had to be, law and order. I've got to. No, it's compassion. It's about looking in people's eyes and saying what is right and what is fair. And for the first time on the congressional level, after many years, both administrations and both Congresses and everything else saying, everybody putting up the perfect, and then when they couldn't get the perfect, they say, see, well, we just couldn't get anything. Hakeem and I came together and said perfect is irrelevant and means nothing to somebody sitting in a cell with no hope. And so for the first time, this is what I was so proud of this partnership, and we've seen it come out, Matthew, and that it does mean something, because now people are willing in the Senate and the House to say criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, that we may want to see move faster or it might move slower, is actually being talked about now. And we can disagree on a plethora of targets. There's my Columbia word. Okay? Not much, but I didn't get pharmacological or whatever, being funny. But if we can do that, then what can we do? So I think this is the step that in our town, it sometimes takes those of us going out and saying, let's push the envelope a little bit further to make sure that quote, zone of discussion is now further than it was. And I think that's the best part that I saw come out of it.
And I think we all agree that before we get to another sort of comprehensive second step bill, we've got to ensure proper implementation of first step. But there are some low-hanging fruit bills filed. You mentioned the Fair Chance Act. There's Clean Slate that also has bipartisan sponsorship. There's a bail reform bill that one of my home state senators, Senator Rand Paul, joined with Kamala Harris. And by the way, I cannot think of two more different people than those. I know both of them well, very different. Joined together to incentivize states to move forward in shifting away from money bail. I mean, there are a lot of really good bills that are filed. And I think Fair Chance, it's ready for floor time, right? So
tweet this, put Fair Chance on the floor.
So, what's the holdup in moving these piecemeal, low-hanging fruit bills so at least we can be moving forward, as we're moving toward the oversight hearing that Congressman Jeffries has so zealously called for?
Well, I certainly expect that there will be additional movement in this Congress because of the foundation that has been laid, the conversations that Doug was talking about, and the fact that we believe that fundamentally the American people want to see Congress get things done. And in this area where we clearly have an overcriminalization problem, a mass incarceration problem in the United States of America, in many ways attributed to what I would characterize as the failed war on drugs. When it was first launched in the early 1970s, there were less than 350,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, 2.2 million. More than any other country in the world, we incarcerate folks. That's an overcriminalization stain on our society. It's an $80 billion per year failed government program, particularly when so many people who have been incarcerated are nonviolent drug offenders, and obviously it disproportionately impacts many low-income communities, regardless of race, and/or low-income communities of color in the Black and Latino community. And the First Step Act in Congress was able to bring together Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, the ACLU, the Koch brothers, the left, the right, people all along the ideological spectrum with the Trump administration. And I've often said that when you can pull together what I sometimes refer to as a coalition of the unusual suspects, that captures the imagination of people within Congress and captures the imagination of people throughout the country. And that's what all of us have been able to do on criminal justice reform. And that's why I believe we will be able to keep it going.
Can we get a vote on fair chance or what?
I'll refer to my majority person here. I don't control the floor part anymore, but we can. And I agree with Hakeem on this. Look, the first 6 months of any transition from one to the next is going to be the minority coming into the majority has got in this case 8 years of pent up. Let's go do stuff and a lot of other things, investigations and stuff. We get that. I've always said that's fine, but we are grown-ups that can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think we've been 6 months in. We're getting to the point now to where there's a lot of stuff that can come back up that we're starting to hear, and that's my desire, because it can't get back to the place that there has to be discussion here. There was, I think, when you started looking at the First Step Act, you started looking at how people were responding to that. You go out and you talk to community groups and you talk about the real lives of people, both from a Republican perspective or a Democratic perspective. It resonates with folks. And it actually, there is a deep longing. People believe that we should have our partisan perspective. That's fine. They get that. And sometimes they don't like it. They'll tell you they don't, but we can go in a whole nother conversation about why that's not really true. But they want us to have our stark perspective, but they also, at the end of the day, just like our founders, find a way to get something done. At the end of the day, everybody who goes to a job, no matter if they get along with their boss or don't get along with their boss or don't get along, they have to get something done. And I think from our perspective, whether it's no matter who's in control, finding these areas of commonality, and I think this is why Hakeem stepped last year in taking on, factions in his side, me being able to work with factions on our side, and then working with the Senate to get something done, gives us the impetus to do this. We can't wait through another election cycle. That's something I learned from Hakeem. Election cycles are not the solution to getting it done next time. It's the push to get it done now.
Love that. So we started with you, Matthew. We're going to conclude with you. So based on my review of Twitter, because everything on Twitter is true, you have been active in Tennessee, Oklahoma, I know Kentucky because I brought you there, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Missouri, and now you're in New York, where some really great reforms passed this last year in the governor's budget, and New Yorkers United for Justice has been doing great work. Where's Jeff Cook McCormick? Aha, shout out. So of all the states that you've worked in, what state is most poised to do the most criminal justice reform? Where should groups be focusing their efforts?
I would say one of the states that's doing a pretty good job is Kentucky.
Oh,
but I would
thank
say
you.
one of the states, poised that I would like to see, because actually has the largest incarcerated rate of their citizens, is Oklahoma. And I did have able to speak with Governor Stitt as well as Lieutenant Governor Pinnell, and they're committed to criminal justice reform. They inherited that state. As a matter of fact, he's a new governor, and he's doing remarkable. I just hope everybody help him get on board with what he's doing. So I would say that the organization, to answer the question, what more help, or what state can we be more helping, I would say the state of Oklahoma.
I'm just going to finish up with this question. You're so positive. Most people who work in the criminal justice space, and I'll include myself in this, the work is very bipolar. I mean, I have 3 or 4 meltdowns a day, but you're so positive and you have such an uplifting voice. mean, how do you maintain that happiness?
The fact that first and foremost I'm a Christian, but also because I was incarcerated for a 35-year period and only served 22 years. But during that 22 years, I was there with 4 different presidencies. And I've seen people walk away from criminal justice reform, and now I see people walking towards it. So I remain hopeful just based off of that. And as both of the representatives stated, it's a bipartisan issue that all parties agree. We know something needs to be done. Wisdom is oftentimes acknowledging the problem and coming up with solutions to that problem. So I remain hopeful based off of that.
Okay, yeah.
Holly, can I say something about that? And I think this is talking about only about 10%, and Matthew is such a wonderful spokesman. What he said right there was so true about the states. But, you know, you look at the total incarceration, 10% roughly federally. And so the vast incarceration levels is at your state and your locals here. So this is, you know, we're providing the emphasis from that you can talk about it on our level, but it's that state level action where, you know, it impacts more and more people every year. So that's the work that's being done on state level. Don't give up. You're the front line. You're literally on the front line to make big changes. Keep it up.
Amen. Okay, so we're out of time. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 10 minutes left. Is that right? Sorry, 5 minutes left. Oh, questions. Okay, so I'm going to start because I actually would not like to hear from him at 11 o'clock tonight. Where is Rabbi Weiss? Where is he? So Rabbi Weiss has a question about elderly and compassionate release, which I know is an issue that's so important to Aleph. And so instead of me botching your question and you getting upset, I would like for you to ask it.
Well, thank you so much, Holly. Thank you, Congressman. So as you know, the First Step Act has a provision that releases elderly inmates to home confinement if they reach 2/3 of their sentence and they're 60 years old or older. So the question is, how do you interpret the 2/3? Do you include good time credit or not good time credit? As we've been discussing, all inmates earn good time credit for good behavior. But the way that this statute was interpreted and drafted back in the 2007 Second Chance Act, it was written in a way where it does not include good time. We think that's unfair. And we'd like to know, what can Congress do to address that, to fix that, so that these elderly inmates get that good time credit that they earn through good behavior. And thank you, Holly, for putting me on the spot. Really,
Sure.
what a friend
First of all,
for.
thank you for your leadership, and it's been tremendous, and it was part, really, just a coalition of people from all across the country, different races, different religions, even within, you know, the city of New York, you know, a partnership that, you know, spanning people who don't often work together on a wide variety of issues, but who work together on this one. And I agree with your interpretation. I think that part of the general dynamics here is that there are people within the incarceration system that exists in the country who still are of a mindset that their interpretations lend themselves to additional time, not less time. And the country has begun to change in that regard. And I think the benefit of the doubt should always be given, even if there's ambiguity, but the benefit of the doubt should always be given toward transitioning people out of incarceration. And from the standpoint of, I think, congressional intent, we'll look at whether there's some clarification language that can be done. Clearly, our intention was to accelerate the capacity of elderly inmates or infirm inmates to be able to move out of incarceration into home confinement by lowering the age of eligibility, of course, from 65 to 60, and reducing the amount of time of the sentence served from 3/4 to 2/3. And the fact that we made that good time credit fix, asked for it to be retroactively applied, I think all suggests what the general congressional intent is. Whether there's some clarification needed in terms of people who are looking at the statutory language with a strict constructionalist approach, that's certainly something that we'll explore. And Rabbi Weiss, we look forward to working together in that regard.
Thank you so much. And just to add to that, that this would actually be consistent with how BOP interprets all other transfers. Right. Anytime BOP transfers someone from any level of security to a lower level of security, in fact, when any inmate gets into the BOP system, it automatically includes their good time credit. Yeah. So we're asking for consistency that the elderly program should be the same as every other program that BOP conducts in their system.
Yeah. I agree, and I agree with Hakeem on this. But this is another reason for the hearing. This is another reason for oversight, just to clarify. But anybody that's trying to read this at BOP as a slowing or a non-acceleration is just frankly been not listening to anything that went on or properly interpreting, what was changed. We'll tape your question because it's exactly why we need a hearing and why we've needed a hearing, to begin this process, to hold that accountable. And again, we're in the appropriations process as well right now, so that's another, area for us that we'll be putting through. And then we've got to have a Senate version on this as well. But bringing those questions out instead of the one thing that can be detrimental in any kind of congressional oversight is but it happens all the time, is advocacy groups or ones in the system saying, we have heard. That's why, and that is a valid question, but it's a reason for Congress to say, let's find out instead of just wondering, we have heard. And I think you make a great point in that regard.
And I would just add that when the prison reform effort first started, in terms of legislation that had been introduced maybe 2 Congresses ago, the amount of money that was authorized in that prison reform legislation before it was rephrased as the First Step Act, I believe was $14 million over a 2-year period of time. Clearly insufficient. In the initial version of the bill that Doug Collins and I introduced and passed through the House, we dramatically increased that number to $250 million over a 5-year period of time, more than I think the GEO indicated was sufficient to make sure we could bring the reentry programming to life. And then in the final version of the bill that was signed into law by the president, that number was increased to $375 million over a 5-year period of time. $75 million per year in additional funding for the Bureau of Prisons, specifically related to reentry programming and things of this nature. And in the appropriations bill that will be on the floor of the House of Representatives in the next week or so, we now appropriate the first $75 million of that $375 million over a 5-year period of time. So from a resource perspective, the commitment is certainly there in the House, and I assume it will also be there in the Senate, and we'll make sure that when the money is allocated, it of course is spent to bring this reentry programming to life.
And don't worry, I'm making a list that we can include in the Congressman's letter to leadership where they zealously call for an oversight hearing. Greg DeRoche.
Thank you, Holly. And this question to the Congressman. One of the tools that governors have different than the BOP, structurally, is the Department of Corrections head reports usually to the governor, not to the Attorney General. And at the federal level, we have the DOJ overseeing the Bureau of Prisons. Would it make sense if the Bureau of Prisons was empowered to actually implement some of the changes in your First Step Act and your future Second Step from an oversight perspective too? You could hold them accountable more directly than through another organization that has a different mission.
I mean, it's a possibility. I think in a bigger scheme, and I'll just say this from a bigger scheme, just in criminal justice reform, but in federal oversight and other things, especially on the budgetary side, there's a lot of things we can do that we just don't do. And frankly, Congress has gave up a lot of authority under both administrations and through both Republican and Democrat leaderships in the House. What you just talked about, I mean, BOP is accountable to Congress right now. We fund that. We're passing CJS budget in the next week. I think it's on the floor. I can't even know about the next week. Those monies come through subcommittees that hear these requests, and I think sometimes we set it up as the AG under either party being the bad guy or bad person in this. And I think we've got to get back to where we're actually pushing these forwards through in the appropriations process, holding the money accountable, making sure that it's going where we need to go under what administration. It doesn't matter. Take off the title. it would be, it was hard enough to get some of these things done through, to actually go through and change the structure of Bureau of Prisons, acting outside the Attorney General. I mean, I'm all for a good fight, but, you know, that would be a really tough lift under either side, administration-wise.
This gentleman?
Yeah, hi. I just want to commend everyone in this room for the dedication to criminal justice reform. I work at the Center for Justice here at Columbia, and I think if everyone is truly invested in criminal justice reform, we have to be very vigilant about the language we use. The term inmates is, you know, it's very derogatory. It's very difficult to galvanize people to care about an inmate or a convict. The man on stage, Matthew Charles, is not a former inmate. You know, he's formerly incarcerated, but he's not a former inmate. He's a man. He's a brother. He's a cousin. He's a son. So I think we have to be very vigilant about the language we use, and that's where most of the change has to come from. And I just want to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, we agree, and I think the first step refers to formally incarcerated, reentering society, transformed. Don't ask me what the step means, but no, it successfully transitioning every person. So that was what first step stood for. We agree from a language standpoint. It's embedded in the language of the bill.
Can I call on this young man right here? See, now that I've asked, you can't say no.
Hi, this is for Matthew Charles. I imagine that after 22 years in prison and being released, there's a certain amount of PTSD that goes with that experience. You don't just transition overnight. And for those of us who have not been incarcerated, you develop a certain amount of social capital where you can screw up, you know, in ways big and small and move on with life. And if you've been incarcerated for such a long time, I imagine that's greatly diminished. So can you talk about some of the challenges of going from being a federal prisoner to working on federal prison policy so quickly?
Yes, I was released in 2016. I was out for nearly 2 years during that time. That's the reason I like to use the word warehoused as far as when it comes to mass incarceration, because that's literally what it was before First Step Act was implemented or passed, therefore is being implemented. But the First Step Act passed, and it allows rehabilitation to be inside of the prison. But I was released, and the reason I use the word warehouse is because you've taken out of society for a particular period of time, and then you return to society, whether you've changed personally or not, whether you understand now that you no longer have the threat of being harmed in such a closed environment of being in prison, and as well as technology has changed. So therefore, when I was released in 2016, I was out for 22 months, nearly a 2-year period. And I started at a halfway house. And because of that, I was able to get reacclimated to society, as well as come up to speed with all the technology, because when I left, you know, they had the big brick phones. Now everybody, even as I was riding the bus coming back to Nashville, they was just going away, like, you know, like you'd play video games back in the day, they doing it on their phones, tweeting, so, or texting. So therefore, I had to get used to all of that, as well as being around people who were just there because they supposed to be, as opposed to there to do you harm or possible harm. So the fact that I was able to return to the halfway house for those 9 months in 2016, that helped me greatly. But also the fact that now we're looking at, as we stated, rehabilitation for those that are inside, starting now. They're able to get vocational trades, they're able to take educational skills, advantages, and things of that nature that's going to prep them for their return into society. And then, of course, hopefully there'll be churches and organizations, as well as support systems through family and friends to help them to get reacclimated once they're released. And as I think it's Carol most definitely know, there's a lot of people in there with life sentences or sentences greater than 30 years. And the fact that they have those sentences, they are the ones that I continue to speak on behalf of, because they deserve their second chance as well, even if they have to learn the hard way. And I'm not talking about learn society the hard way. I'm talking about learn to get reused to those things, such as not being told when to go here or being told when to eat. That's a lesson they would love to learn just by being free. So.
Well, I want to thank everyone so much for your time and attention and patience this afternoon. I do not fancy myself a criminal justice reform expert. I'm a mercenary. I persuade these fine gentlemen to do the things that you all say are best for our justice system. It's the folks like Jeremy Travis with Arnold Ventures and Craig and Rabbi Weiss and Gary who really, I think, are pushing the ball forward. We're so grateful for your partnership and for this great coalition that was able to push First Step across the finish line. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Matthew Charles, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and Congressman Doug Collins.
Thank you.